The most technologically advanced product almost always loses. This completely defies basic business logic. We are relentlessly conditioned to believe that the bleeding edge of technology guarantees market dominance. Trillions of dollars are aggressively burned every single year in a violent, desperate race for the fastest processor, the highest resolution, and the most complex artificial intelligence. Tech giants bleed themselves dry fighting over microscopic improvements. But one highly secretive, notoriously protective company completely refuses to play this game. They actively, intentionally use obsolete technology. They build their flagship products using cheap, outdated, discarded components from entirely different industries. And by doing so, they have completely humiliated the most powerful technology empires on the face of the earth, generating billions in pure profit while their rivals drown in research and development debt. There is a deeply guarded, highly counterintuitive psychological framework behind this madness. It is a philosophy that turns technological weakness into an impenetrable, unshakable competitive moat. We will reveal the exact mechanics of this hidden strategy and how it completely rewrites the fundamental laws of innovation a little later in this breakdown. Welcome to the incredibly ruthless, hyper-competitive global video game industry. It is a market historically defined by absolute, unrelenting technological warfare. In one corner, you have massive, multi-trillion-dollar conglomerates like Sony and Microsoft. They aggressively sell their gaming consoles at a massive financial loss, desperately hoping to make the money back on software. They build incredibly powerful, highly expensive supercomputers designed to sit in your living room. In the other corner, you have Nintendo. Nintendo does not build supercomputers. Nintendo routinely releases hardware that is mathematically a decade behind the competition. Yet they consistently shatter global sales records. They dictate the cultural zeitgeist. They aggressively print money while their competitors desperately struggle for razor-thin margins. So how exactly does a company using vastly inferior, practically obsolete technology consistently dominate the most advanced, highly funded tech giants on the planet? That is the exact question we are answering today. To deeply understand the absolute genius of this strategic framework, we must travel back to the mid-20th century. Japan post-World War II. Nintendo was absolutely not a video game company. They were a struggling, highly traditional manufacturer of Hanafuda playing cards. They had been aggressively printing cardboard since the year 1889. But by the late 1960s, the playing card market was completely dying. The Japanese public was aggressively moving on to more modern forms of entertainment. Nintendo was bleeding cash. The executive board completely panicked. They desperately tried to aggressively pivot into entirely new industries. They launched a highly controversial chain of love hotels. They tried to manufacture instant rice. They started a massive, highly expensive taxi company. Every single one of these desperate ventures failed spectacularly. They were entirely out of their depths. The J-curve had aggressively dipped into a terrifying, seemingly bottomless abyss. The century-old company was staring directly at absolute bankruptcy. They needed a massive, unprecedented miracle. They needed a completely new philosophy. Enter a young, incredibly humble maintenance engineer named Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi was not a high-level executive. He was not a brilliant, highly educated computer scientist. His strictly assigned job was to simply maintain the complex mechanical assembly lines that aggressively printed the failing playing cards. He was a tinkerer. One day, the fiercely intimidating president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was aggressively touring the failing factory floor. He suddenly noticed something highly unusual. Yokoi, completely bored out of his mind, had built a strange, highly complex extending mechanical arm strictly for his own personal amusement. Yamauchi stopped. He aggressively stared at the crude, mechanical toy. He did not violently fire Yokoi for wasting company time. He instantly ordered Yokoi to immediately refine the toy for mass market production. They aggressively launched it under the name the Ultra Hand. It became an absolute, overnight cultural phenomenon. It aggressively sold over 1 million units. It single-handedly saved Nintendo from total financial ruin. Yokoi was instantly promoted from a lowly maintenance worker to the absolute head of highly experimental product development. But Yokoi knew he could not compete with massive, highly funded global toy companies by aggressively trying to invent bleeding-edge technology. Nintendo was too poor. They were too small. He had to aggressively rely on a completely different framework. He heavily formalized a deeply profound, highly counterintuitive design philosophy. He called it Kareta Gijutsu no Suihei Shikō. In English, this translates to lateral thinking with withered technology. This is the foundational, unshakable bedrock of the entire Nintendo empire. The philosophy is incredibly precise. Withered technology refers to highly mature, completely proven, widely available technology. Technology that is so old, it has become incredibly cheap to mass produce. The engineering bugs have been completely ironed out. The manufacturing yields are absolutely flawless. Lateral thinking means actively taking that cheap, highly boring, deeply mature technology and aggressively applying it to a completely unexpected, entirely different market. You absolutely do not invent the new technology. You aggressively invent the new application. Let us look closely at how this exact philosophy birthed the modern portable gaming industry. In the late 1970s, global technology companies were locked in a massive, highly expensive arms race to aggressively build the absolute best electronic pocket calculator. The LCD screens required were highly complex and deeply expensive. But as the fierce competition aggressively scaled, massive economies of scale violently kicked in. Suddenly, the global market was heavily flooded with incredibly cheap, highly reliable, completely boring LCD calculator screens. The technology had rapidly withered. One day, Yokoi was riding the incredibly crowded bullet train in Tokyo. He noticed a highly exhausted, deeply bored Japanese businessman aggressively pressing the buttons on an expensive LCD calculator simply to pass the time. The profound aha moment violently struck. Yokoi did not see a tool for complex mathematics. He saw a highly portable, completely frictionless canvas for human entertainment. He aggressively bought massive quantities of the incredibly cheap, withered calculator LCD technology. He completely stripped away the boring mathematics. He programmed highly simple, deeply engaging digital games onto the cheap screens. He aggressively launched the Game Watch. It was a massive, unprecedented global success. It aggressively sold over 43 million units worldwide. It completely funded Nintendo's massive expansion into the home console market. But the ultimate, highly terrifying test of this exact philosophy occurred a decade later. The brutal, unforgiving handheld console wars of 1989. Nintendo aggressively launched the Game Boy. It was heavily designed by Gunpei Yokoi, using the exact, strict principles of lateral thinking with withered technology. Objectively, the Game Boy was an absolute technological dinosaur. It was large. It was heavy. It aggressively featured a disgusting, highly blurry, deeply terrible Pea-Green screen that could not even produce actual colors. In the dark, it was completely unplayable. The massive legacy competitors smelled blood in the water. Atari aggressively launched the Lynx. Sega violently launched the Game Gear. Both of these rival machines were absolute technological marvels. They fiercely boasted incredibly powerful, highly advanced, full-color backlit screens. They were strictly designed to mathematically destroy the pathetic Pea-Green Game Boy. The elite industry analysts confidently predicted Nintendo's absolute, total destruction. How could a blurry, colorless dinosaur possibly compete with a highly advanced, full-color supercomputer? Because the analysts completely, fundamentally misunderstood the core physics of portable entertainment. They deeply obsessed over the bleeding-edge technology. They completely forgot about the deeply flawed, highly frustrated human being actually holding the device. The Atari Lynx and the Sega Game Gear were incredibly powerful. But that massive power required absolutely massive amounts of physical energy. Both machines aggressively required 6 highly expensive AA batteries. And because the bleeding-edge, full-color backlit screens heavily drained the power, the batteries violently died in exactly 2 hours. They were completely useless for a long family road trip. They were a terrifying, highly expensive logistical nightmare for parents. The Game Boy, however, aggressively used highly efficient, deeply withered technology. Because the Pea-Green screen was completely unlit, it required incredibly tiny amounts of power. The Game Boy aggressively ran for 15 straight, uninterrupted hours on just 4 standard AA batteries. Furthermore, because the internal components were incredibly mature and highly simplified, the Game Boy was virtually indestructible. You could aggressively drop it down a flight of concrete stairs, and it would flawlessly continue to play Tetris. The result was an absolute, unmitigated corporate massacre. Sega and Atari completely failed. They bled millions of dollars. The highly advanced, full-color Game Gear aggressively sold a pathetic 10 million units before being violently discontinued. The terrible, deeply obsolete, incredibly blurry Game Boy aggressively sold 118 million units. It completely conquered the entire globe. Nintendo mathematically proved that the human consumer absolutely does not care about your bleeding-edge technical specifications. The consumer strictly cares about the uninterrupted, highly frictionless delivery of pure emotional joy. But this aggressive strategy is incredibly difficult to maintain. As the decades passed, the massive tech empires of Sony and Microsoft aggressively entered the home console market. They heavily pushed the industry into an incredibly toxic, highly expensive race for hyper-realistic, high-definition graphics. By the early 2000s, Nintendo completely lost their way. They aggressively tried to fiercely compete on raw technical power with the Nintendo GameCube. It was a beautiful, highly advanced machine. And it was a massive, devastating commercial failure. They were completely drowning in the exact same commodity hell that almost destroyed Apple in the 1990s. When you aggressively compete strictly on raw teraflops and gigahertz, the products become completely indistinguishable. The J-curve had aggressively dipped again. Nintendo was violently pushed to the absolute brink of total irrelevance. They desperately needed to violently return to their core, fundamental roots. They aggressively resurrected the ghost of Gunpei Yokoi. They heavily returned to lateral thinking with Withered Technology. While Sony and Microsoft aggressively spent billions designing the incredibly complex, bleeding-edge PS3 and Xbox 360, Nintendo aggressively went in the exact, violent opposite direction. They strictly looked at the highly mature, deeply withered technology of the early smartphone industry. Specifically, tiny, highly cheap accelerometers and infrared sensors. These components were incredibly boring. They simply told a smartphone which way it was being physically tilted. Nintendo aggressively stripped this highly cheap technology out of the mobile phone. They shoved it into a plastic television remote. They completely ignored high-definition graphics entirely. They built a highly underpowered, technologically obsolete white box. They aggressively launched the Nintendo Wii. The hardcore gaming community absolutely hated it. The elite technology press aggressively mocked it. The machine could not even confidently output a standard high-definition video signal. But the Wii completely bypassed the hardcore gamer. It aggressively targeted the deeply intimidated, completely non-technical human being. My grandmother could not navigate a complex, highly intimidating dual-analog Xbox controller with 16 different buttons. It heavily spiked her cognitive load. But she deeply understood the intuitive, frictionless physical motion of swinging a plastic remote exactly like a tennis racket. And the withered technology completely vanished into the background. The pure, highly accessible psychological joy aggressively took over. The Nintendo Wii violently destroyed its highly advanced competitors. It aggressively sold over 100 million units. It completely redefined the entire global entertainment landscape. They heavily executed this exact same aggressive strategy again a decade later with the Nintendo Switch, aggressively using an old, highly mature, severely underpowered NVIDIA mobile processor to build a massive, incredibly profitable hybrid empire. So what is the ultimate, terrifying revelation here? What specifically makes this deeply counterintuitive strategy so dangerously effective across multiple decades? It is the profound, unshakable realization that bleeding-edge technology actually heavily degrades extreme human creativity. When a massive company heavily relies strictly on the most powerful, incredibly advanced technology to sell a product, they become deeply, violently lazy. They aggressively use hyper-realistic, incredibly expensive high-definition graphics as a massive psychological crutch. They completely forget how to actually design a deeply engaging, fundamentally fun experience. Lateral thinking with Withered Technology is absolutely not just a highly clever way to save manufacturing money. It is a highly aggressive, mathematically enforced creative constraint. When you absolutely cannot strictly rely on flashy, bleeding-edge visuals to successfully sell your product, the core, fundamental user loop must be absolutely flawless. You are violently forced to intensely innovate on the highly emotional, deeply psychological axis of human interaction. Furthermore, Withered Technology completely eliminates massive operational risk. While Microsoft and Sony aggressively suffer through massive, highly expensive hardware shortages, terrifying manufacturing defects, and catastrophic server crashes, Nintendo smoothly ships millions of perfectly reliable, highly profitable plastic boxes. And that is the profound secret. In the hyper-competitive global market, the true value of a product is absolutely never the raw power of the internal silicon chip. The true value is the total absence of friction standing between the human being and the core emotional experience. When you aggressively embrace the highly uncomfortable discipline of deeply proven, boring technology, you do not actively decrease the value of your product. You completely elevate the core human value. You force your massive engineering teams to actively stop obsessing over the complex machine and start aggressively obsessing over the deeply flawed, highly emotional human being. But actively executing this ruthless philosophy in the complex, highly political reality of modern corporate strategy is incredibly rare. The absolute worst, most terrifying offenders of terrible bleeding-edge feature creep are massive enterprise software companies. Think deeply about the massive, agonizing crisis inside the modern corporate workplace. Executive boards are deeply, hopelessly addicted to the dangerous illusion of bleeding-edge technology. They aggressively demand that their highly complex internal management software must include completely unproven artificial intelligence. They demand complex blockchain integrations. They demand deeply confusing, highly fragile bleeding-edge features that their actual human workforce absolutely despises. They actively build the enterprise equivalent of the Sega Game Gear. It is incredibly expensive, highly fragile, and deeply hated by the humans violently forced to use it every single day. The cognitive friction is completely suffocating. It entirely destroys team morale and actively damages core organizational alignment. This is exactly why ambitious, highly successful modern global organizations absolutely must completely rethink their strategic internal infrastructure. You urgently need a digital environment that ruthlessly rejects the toxic corporate philosophy of bleeding-edge feature bloat. You need a platform heavily built on the exact, proven psychology of frictionless engagement and highly mature, bulletproof strategic alignment. That is exactly where StrategyBoard completely changes the massive corporate paradigm. StrategyBoard is absolutely not just another highly complex, intensely fragile bleeding-edge software toy. It is aggressively and beautifully designed, using the exact core principles of absolute cognitive ease. Instead of relentlessly burying your executive team in a terrifying avalanche of incredibly unproven, highly confusing technological buzzwords, StrategyBoard meticulously streamlines the absolute core functions of complex strategic planning. It functions as the ultimate, highly reliable digital whiteboard for your entire global workforce. It forcefully and beautifully strips away the complex, highly toxic digital noise. It actively provides your ambitious leadership team with the exact, crystal-clear operational visibility they desperately need to rapidly align massive teams, rigorously track execution, and deeply map long-term corporate growth. It completely removes the terrifying friction of complex project management by aggressively relying on deeply proven, highly mature visual collaboration frameworks. It is the highly guarded, elite operational secret weapon for ambitious companies that deeply want to successfully align their massive global workforce, completely free from the suffocating, highly destructive burden of fragile software bloat. Ultimately, the devastating, highly disruptive history of Nintendo definitively proves a highly fundamental, entirely inescapable law of modern corporate strategy. The ultimate corporate victor is almost never the company that builds the most technologically advanced, incredibly complex machine. The ultimate corporate victor is always the company that builds the absolute, most reliable, incredibly frictionless human experience. When you finally stop aggressively chasing the massive, terrifying illusion of the bleeding edge, and you rigorously start fighting for absolute, unshakable lateral creativity, you completely destroy your heavily bloated, deeply expensive competitors. If you learned something incredibly new today, hit the like button and immediately subscribe for more elite strategy breakdowns. And let us precisely know in the comments below what massive company's hidden strategy should we completely unlock next.